Hello, everybody. Welcome. This is my name is David Turner. I'm the Director of Standards Development for the FIDO Alliance, and welcome to the Account Recovery Best Practices Roundtable. Joining me today, we have Robyn Hicock. She's a Senior Program Manager in the Identity, Security and Protection team at Microsoft. We have Abbie Barbir, Senior Security Advisor in the Mobile Innovation Group at CVS. Christiaan Brand, Senior Product Manager, Identity and Security at Google, and Hidehito Gomi, Senior Chief Researcher at Yahoo Japan Corporation. So welcome all of you. The way we're going to break the session down today is I'm having this brief information intro. Then Gomi-san is going to give a presentation on a paper that FIDO produced about account recovery best practices. I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of the identity proofing work that's currently being done within the FIDO Alliance, and then we'll get into the roundtable where I'll pose some questions and hopefully have a discussion amongst all of the panelists today. So just to set the stage, FIDO, of course, is all about authentication securely. Pardon me. But as everyone knows, even with a lot of these very strong secure systems in place, account recovery still remains an ongoing problem. And there are a number of approaches to solving it. And so today we're going to talk about some of the challenges and some of the approaches that different companies and organizations are taking to deal with it. So I'm going to jump right in and welcome Gomi-san from Yahoo, who's going to present on the FIDO's account recovery best practices.
Thank you for introduction, David. Hello, everyone. My name is Hidehito Gomi, working at Yahoo Japan Corporation. I'm going to talk about an overview of FIDO's published guidance on account recovery. First of all, I will talk about the general challenge for account recovery. Account recovery is known as the process of restoring access to user account because the user loses credentials such as password. When the user forgets password, he cannot access the account using password authentication. In this situation, in order to retain access to the account, the server must verify whether the user is legitimate or not. So the server needs to have a verification method different from password authentication. I guess many people should have such an experience of recovery using SMS or email. I will talk about account recovery challenge for FIDO authentication. FIDO authentication is based on public key cryptography. A pair of private and public keys are respectively stored at Authenticator and FIDO relying party, for short, RP. These keys have cryptographic binding. Through this binding, a user can be authenticated and access the account at RP. If an authenticator device is lost, user becomes unable to access the account. So the challenge in this case is that RP needs an alternative method for verifying the user to access account while retaining security and usability because it has been lost. To address this challenge, we published a white paper on account recovery. This white paper describes recommended account recovery practices. So please check out the paper. I will briefly explain the paper next. So the white paper describes 5 two-step strategy for account recovery. We recommend that RPs have the following 2 phases of recovery design consideration. The first step is that RPs encourage users to register multiple authenticators. This can reduce account recovery needs because users can continue to access their account using FIDO authentication. So we think this is a recommended best practice. The second step is to examine the other options of actual recovery execution, such as identity proofing and onboarding mechanisms. FIDO Alliance does not recommend weaker recovery options, but RPs may consider various options depending on their use cases and security policy. I will talk about multiple authenticators more in the next slides. Introducing multiple authenticators indicates building multiple cryptographic bindings between authenticator and user account, as shown in this slide. These bindings are independent with each other. So even if authenticator 1 is lost and becomes unavailable, the user can still access the account using authenticator 2. Please note in this case, the user does not do a specific recovery process, but authenticates with authenticator 2 as an ordinary FIDO authentication procedure. Then a question may arise, how to register additional authenticators? To address such a question, we developed another white paper, Multiple Authenticators for Reducing Account Recovery Needs. Please check out this paper and its webinar, but now I will talk about this more detail. In the multiple authenticator scenario, an authenticator has already been registered and has a cryptographic binding with user account. On this premise, challenge in this case is how to additionally register not yet registered authenticators, such as security keys, PCs, and smartphones without degrading security. I will explain operation for registering additional authenticator. In this case, authenticator 1 has already been registered. On this premise, as a first step, user establishes an authentication session using FIDO authentication. Then user connects a new authenticator 2 and finally executes FIDO registration. As a result, using the existing session, authenticator 2 is registered securely based on FIDO protocol. There are some variations for types of authenticator devices. This slide shows 3 use cases. In type A, 2 devices interact with each other using CTAP2 through some transport channel, such as Bluetooth BLE. Google actually implements this type of use case. Type A also uses CTAP2 as a transport mechanism, but by roaming authenticators. Type C is an example by out-of-band using QR code. This is not necessarily secure because there may be some security risk for man-in-the-middle attacks, but RPs may implement by their own discretion. I will talk about further consideration for deployment. I was explaining device loss incident and use cases using multiple authenticators, but you may have a question how to handle FIDO credentials originally managed by Authenticator 1 and RP. In this situation, a malicious user may happen to find and obtain Authenticator 1, whose owner is the legitimate user. Private key 1, in this case, can be accessed by only the legitimate user after local verification. So it is very difficult for the malicious user to access the private key 1. But if the RP may still consider malicious user's physical access involves security risk, RP may delete the corresponding public key 1 when receiving the legitimate user's request on the basis of its security policy, like this. More consideration. After deleting the public key 1, the user is back to a single authenticator 2. And so then by evaluating the authentication session for authenticator 2, RP may allow the user to additionally register authenticator 3 based on its security policy. In this way, the user can manage more authenticators effectively for reducing recovery needs. I will conclude my talk. Using multiple authenticator is currently the recommended best practice to manage account recovery for FIDO deployments because it enables users to retain account access while avoiding further recovery mechanisms. FIDO recommends that RPs implement multiple authenticators use cases using FIDO protocol, but continues to assess how to improve security and usability of recovery process, including through work in the identity verification and binding working group, which David Turner will describe the next. Thank you for attention.
Thank you very much for that presentation. It was very good, thank you. So as was just presented, there's still a challenge with doing account recovery. And recognizing this, the FIDO Alliance started a working group last year called the Identity Verification and Binding Working Group. So I'm just going to give a very quick overview of what it's focused on and what it's trying to do. So as FIDO is based largely on or primarily on proofing through possession, we're looking at similar sorts of solutions for account recovery mechanisms. And in this case, the possessed item can be ID from any number of authoritative sources or even other devices. And so what we're looking for is developing ways to help with that process so that it can be done in a more secure fashion, and especially these days, so it can be done without having to have a face-to-face interaction in order to do proofing. One of the challenges that we discovered is that there are lots of systems out there for doing virtual proofing or online proofing, but one of the problems is that there are no metrics for determining the quality of the processes, the qualities of the tests, the consistencies of the test. And so where FIDO has been putting its energies is much like what we've done with biometric authentication certification. We're focusing on the certification process for using documents online for doing proofing. And so today, different relying parties have systems in place, but the challenge, as I said, is that there's no standardized acceptance criteria. It would be like having fingerprint readers and not knowing, how good they are. How often do they accept good fingerprints? How often do they reject bad fingerprints? So we're looking to establish the same kinds of criteria for account proofing using documents. The other thing is that we're looking to streamline the process by helping to reduce the time and costs that are usually required to implement processes like these. So the first scenario that we've been looking at is the so-called selfie matching, in which you take some sort of trusted identity-based or identity document, could be a passport, could be a driver's license, and there's really two parts to this. The first part is reliably being able to identify that this is a legitimate document, that the document hasn't been it's not been modified, that it's not a fraudulent document. So that's the first step. And then the second step is to take a picture of the user and be able to do the matching between the picture and the user that presents themselves. One of the key criteria there is the liveness tests that need to be established as well. Our current work is mostly, initially at least, on the criteria for evaluation of the documents. And then our next phase will be going into criteria for evaluation of the face recognition, but in particular with the liveness controls. So again, the goal here is not to tell people how to do the testing in the same way that our biometric certification doesn't prescribe how to do fingerprint reading or facial recognition. Rather, it's to set guidance for the certification of the processes that you would use for doing possession-based verification procedures. They'll be defining criteria for solution performance. They'll be deploying a program to support the adoption of this. And so this will show up as a set of defined certification requirements that can be executed by authorized laboratories who are approved to do this kind of certification. And this work will be done in collaboration with our certification and our certification working group, pardon me. And as in addition, we'll be producing, once we have the specifications produced, we'll also be working on market adoption, market awareness, market education to help promote the understanding of how these technologies can be used to improve things like account recovery, which is really where this is primarily meant to be focused. So what I'd like to do now is start a discussion with the different members we have on the panel. And I'm going to start off with some specific questions for some of the panelists and give others a chance to reply. And then I have some further questions to ask depending on how much time we have left. So, Christiaan, I'm going to start with you. Google certainly takes the approach, as I understand it, to encourage people to have multiple user keys. What have you learned about user experience with this approach?
Right, so that's a great question. And of course, I'd say kind of have two separate, I guess, levels of account security that we offer. We have the standard account security model that is what everyone is using when you sign up for a Google account today, at Gmail or even an enterprise type account. Of course, with enterprise, there's more knobs to turn. For consumer accounts, things are a little bit simpler, where we highly encourage you to have devices on the account that we can reach out to whenever you lose access to your, let's say, password. But the idea would be that there's multiple ways to kind of help us, I guess, accept your claim when a user tries to recover access to the account. That's how normal account security works. We have this other program called the Google Advanced Protection Program, where we place a little bit more scrutiny on the account recovery process. But not only that, we only allow non-phishable access mechanisms to get into the account. So basically that means you have to come in with a FIDO authenticator, right? Whether that FIDO authenticator is a physical security key, like a physical fob, or whether that is using your mobile phone, but those mechanisms are the only ones that's able to basically grant access to your particular account. We have a requirement for APP right now that users have more than one authenticator, just as we heard from the previous presenters here, where that's pretty much the best way to gain access to the account and ensure that a user don't lock themselves out when they just lose one thing. The theory there, of course, is it's much harder to lose two things than one. So that certainly is the model today. There is, of course, drawbacks to that, right? It means the user has to now spend twice as much money. They have to get two of these things, make sure that they're always available, at least one of them. So in kind of, pushing the envelope a little bit, we've worked in order to get the mobile phone as an acceptable FIDO authenticator on the account, which now basically means one phone and one physical key puts you in that exact same state where you have a physical key as a backup, and then maybe your phone as your primary access mechanism. Even that is proving tricky, right? It's not always, certainly it's not acceptable to assume that users will have more than one mobile phone. That's usually not the case. Even getting users to buy a physical piece of hardware is it is a obstacle that we have to overcome. So we're thinking pretty heavily about ways in which we can streamline account recovery in a way where maybe even one physical or one device that the user used that's in a kind of a phishing resistant mode might be good enough. The issue then always is, well, how do you do account recovery? It's something that we're still kind of trying to wrap our heads around. But I will say one thing, just in closing here to this particular question. Account recovery is a hard problem, and I think as FIDO, we perhaps have the opportunity to help there. Imagine the following: if a user loses their FIDO authenticator and they had that registered with 40 different RPs, relying parties, wouldn't it be much easier if they had to perform that account recovery process only once and get access to everything versus having to do that 40 times over? If you have to do it 40 times over, you're also essentially kind of subjecting the user to I guess false claims, where some of these accounts might never be returned because the user doesn't have enough information to get those accounts back. So from a pure usability perspective, trying to centralize this, I think, is something that we're going to continue to think about more. And I know it is a very hot topic right now, just because recovery is something we have to try and solve. It's kind of analogous to a user losing a wallet and having to replace every individual credit card, versus when you lose your phone and you get a new phone, all of your credit cards and your payment instruments can be set back up because you have them all on the mobile device. So certainly something to think about a little bit more clearly. But for now, yes, we do require 2 different keys, but we know that that is a stumbling block for some users. So we have to do better in the future.
That's great. Thank you. Well, Robyn, so Windows Hello is primarily based in platform authenticators. They're built into the machine. So it's not as common a situation where people lose their machines. And even then, they usually still have a password backup for the machine or for their accounts. So what are the typical account recovery scenarios that Windows users face?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's true, it's much less common for users to lose their laptops, and Windows Hello is it's great for signing into your PC or even a website. So the scenarios where a Windows user would need account recovery would be, for example, when they don't have their laptop with them and they're using a different device. And often nowadays, since they've been using Windows Hello for so long, they might have even forgotten their password. So the other scenario is when they buy a new device, either a laptop or phone, and they need to sign in for the first time. Or in the unlikely scenario that you mentioned, if they do lose their Windows PC, it's a similar scenario where they'll need to sign in for the first time. So at that point, if they can remember their password, then they can sign in and then set up other passwordless options like Windows Hello again, or biometrics or a PIN. If they don't remember their password, then they have to enter the account recovery flow. And success in that flow all depends on what security info they have registered. So for example, the Authenticator app, a phone number, alternate email, etc. So we have a couple different things at Microsoft to help with this problem. And our team actually handles the account recovery for consumer and enterprise identities. So on the consumer side, meaning protecting accounts that log into Xbox and Outlook.com and other products like that, we have something called our Meet Policy Bar Interrupt, which basically makes everybody have at least one piece of verified security info on their account. So we did this rollout years ago because we were in a really bad place with account recovery, where people were creating accounts and they had no backup options if something went wrong. If they forgot their password or if they got hacked, they'd have to basically call customer support. And at that point, it was really hard to pass our identity verification. So we put everybody through this minimum security bar of having one piece of verified info, either a phone number or alternate email address. So we knew at least everybody had one proof. And that's the minimum bar, but like Christiaan was mentioning, there is a different type of account that can happen. So as Google calls it, I believe the Advanced Recovery Program, we have a similar kind of scenario at Microsoft. So we can have that minimum type of account, category B, and we call the category A is when they're opted into two-step verification. And those users have an extra layer of security on their account, and we require them to have two proofs instead of just one, and both need to be verified. And on top of that, they need printable recovery codes too when they opt into that. So yeah, different layers for different types of users depending on what they're looking for. And also for that category A account that's opted into two-step verification, we take away the less secure ways of account recovery. So we have the last resort customer support form that people fill out, information about their account to try to prove their identity. if you're opted into two-step verification, we actually take that away. And we tell you when you opt in, like, hey, you need better ways of recovery because we're going to not allow the less secure ones anymore. And that's a choice that users make. So yeah, that's also how we handle it. And then the last thing I'll say is the security info is great that you have a verified piece on your account, but what can happen is it goes stale over time. So if somebody moves and they change phone numbers or their alternate email gets hacked or something goes wrong with that proof, then they're also in trouble in terms of account recovery. So the last thing we do, which I think a lot of other companies do the same thing, is kind of a freshness check. So if they haven't used that proof for a while, then we'll say when they log in, like, hey, is this information still accurate? Like, is this still your phone number? Do you still have access to this Authenticator app? Stuff like that. We just remind them and make sure that their proofs are up to date.
I've seen that prompt.
Oh, awesome. That means it's working.
That's great. Thanks very much, Robyn. So Abbie, just with the types of people that you deal with at CVS and pardon me, Aetna, it seems like the multiple authenticator option may not be as reliable option. I guess first, is that a correct assumption? And if it is, then how do you deal with what alternatives do you look at for account recovery?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Multiple authenticators in terms like an extra hardware key, it's tougher because it's consumer based and it's hard to expect someone to carry two keys, their phone and the digital key. But multiple authenticators in terms of like multiple devices you interact with us, it could be possible because if you're coming from a PC, for example, and you have a smartphone, you could think of them as two different type devices. And if you're using FIDO on the PC and FIDO on the mobile, you can use one of the devices as an anchor of trust to recover the account. End of the day, account recovery is hard. And the way to go forward, a lot of the strategy of onboarding need to be changed. So from the get-go, if you are planning to offer a FIDO solution, you need to plan on the account recovery at the moment the account is registered, enrolled, or the user is enrolled. If they do opt in into no password solution, which is a FIDO solution, we make sure that we have enough identity attributes that's good enough to restore access in case of the device is lost or stolen, or they upgrade. If you have a phone and you upgrade, it means you have to re-download the application and you have to come back and re-authenticate. And a lot of time, the current approach is to start with the password flow and then you enroll into the FIDO flow. And we need to move away from that because it's really keep the password in one way or the other as a center, although it reduces the reliance on it. But so we need to go into a smarter solution where you could get or onboarded into a new device if there is another device trusted that we can rely on. And it's part of the things that's being considered. But from the beginning, we don't want to re-enroll you in terms of onboarding. We need to go and do the equivalent of an MFA. So the recovery pass is set at enrollment. And this is a little bit different than what we used to do in the older days where, like, for example, the email address was not validated. Now validation of the email address become important, asking the user about the best way to recover the account if the account access is needed. So we do this at the beginning of the enrollment and the registration process. But it's ongoing. It's a little bit tougher because we deal with legacy systems. Not all of our devices have the same capabilities. Some are FIDO enabled, some are not FIDO enabled. And not every smartphone has all the requirements of stronger authentication in terms of how secure the operating system or whether it has, proper, high level of iOS on it or Android to consider it to be secure. So you have to be flexible and you have to run risk engine on the back end to make sure, it's the claimed identity is the presented identity is the one that's expected. So we need flexibility on how to do account recovery, but it's not easy. It it requires attention and the proper design from the beginning.
Great. Thank you, Abbie. So, Gomi-san, pardon me, Yahoo Japan was one of the first to roll out a large-scale consumer solution based on FIDO, and it's been working quite well for a few years now, I believe. How has the use of FIDO affected how you do account recovery? So now that you have FIDO, broadly adopted by your customer base, how has that changed how you deal with account recovery?
Actually, we are considering how to improve account recovery, but we are still using the traditional account recovery methods. Yes.
Okay. So my other questions actually, people have been generally answering as I've been going along. One of the things I was going to ask is, how much do you address account recovery at the time of account creation? And it sounds like everybody is dealing with that upfront, that as consumers are signing up for their accounts, as they're registering their authenticators, additional data is being gathered to in anticipation of having to solve this problem, which sounds like a good thing. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in and comment on that. If if they found challenges with it, are people resistant to the flow, let's say, when they're trying to set up an account? Do people find all this extra information gathering to be a problem? Are they likely to just skip over it?
I'm happy to jump into that one, David. I think the problem isn't necessarily just gathering the data. I think that's one thing, right? You can embark on a journey where you get this information from accounts. The hard part is keeping this information up to date. I am dealing right now with an account recovery of a colleague's mother she happens to be in the States right now because of COVID, and she can't receive texts on her number. And she's originally from a different country. She forgot her password. She's trying to get back into her account, and she's stuck, right? Because that's the piece of information we would use to do account recovery. It's the phone number. People, they migrate off of carriers. They change numbers. They don't have access because they're roaming, right? It's really tricky keeping that information up to date and then taking action based on it. So, of course, phone number isn't the only thing that one would use. Of course, phone number has its pros and its cons. The same with email address and recovery email addresses. They can be just as brittle. I think the part of like an holistic strategy for account recovery takes a lot of different things into account, right? Typically, where does the user log in from? Have we seen the user log in from a device from which they're trying to file the recovery claim, right? There's loads of things that gets fed into this account recovery engine, which kind of brings me back to it really is hard to run a robust account recovery program. You need lots of engineers, you need lots of money, and you need you basically need a very advanced system for doing account recovery. It isn't simple, which kind of brings me back to that piece. Like, what if we could leverage the scale that companies like, Microsoft that's speaking here, Google, like ourselves, right? What if we can figure out a way in which other organizations could leverage this scale, right? We've tried this before with Account Federation. Federation has its pros and its cons. Not everyone want to click the sign in with Google or the sign in with Facebook button when they do business or interact with third-party services. Maybe FIDO is that middle ground where the interaction for login still remains directly between you and the website, but for account recovery, maybe there's something else backing up all those credentials. So I think there's a lot of interesting nuance here, but account recovery is hard, and keeping that information up to date is almost the hardest part because users skip over it. You can put it in front of their face every time they log in and no one will read it. Like, you just click no, dismiss, I'll deal with this later, until that later comes along and you're sitting with stale account recovery information.
That's great. Thank you. Anyone else have something you may want to add on that particular one?
Yeah, just to build on that. So for account creation for Microsoft consumer accounts, like I mentioned before, we do have that minimum policy bar. So everyone needs at least one piece of verified security info. It also depends on the type of account you're creating. So if you're creating a new Outlook.com account, the way that we handle the balance between enrollment versus friction is we give a 7-day grace period after account creation. So we want to make it super easy, super fast, to create a new account, get into whatever app you're trying to get into. And then after you've been using the account for a week, then we require that piece of security info. And we say, even when they see the interrupt, we say, after that, you get 7 days until it's required. So that's how we try to balance it, because we do see drop off. Anytime you put extra steps, extra screens in front of end users, you're going to see some sort of drop off because of the friction. But because we know account recovery is hard and it is important, we do require that after 7 days. The other types of accounts, we require the verification immediately. So if you're using a Gmail account to sign up for a Microsoft account, then you need to verify that Gmail address right away. We don't give that grace period. Or if you're using a phone number, similar thing, like we require it to be verified immediately. But it's only for those new Outlook.com accounts, then we give extra time. And then also in terms of the, somebody mentioned identity proofing earlier, the problem with account creation, especially for Xbox accounts or any consumer system, is that we want to make it lightweight. We want to make it fast and easy to get in. So then the problem down the road becomes you don't really have anything to compare against. Like even if you have this great system for getting, driver's licenses and a selfie from somebody to prove who they are, we have nothing on that lightweight account to compare it against because they signed up with a phone number and got in super fast. So those are great if you have more information from the customer during account creation.
So you can't figure out who Fortnite God 37 is?
Not very easily, no.
Got it. So I guess another open-ended question. So, obviously, so actually your last point there, Robyn, leads into this nicely, which is that, we, as I discussed, FIDO is looking at ways of helping with one approach to identity proofing. Are there other mechanisms that any of you are looking at or considering, evaluating to help either harden accounts or to help with account recovery? What other approaches might you be looking at? Other technologies or solutions?
Yeah, I can kick it off there. So one of the main things we want to do long term is allowing people to turn off passwords completely on their accounts. So we can't do that yet, but that is kind of the dream, vision, and goal, because we have all these amazing passwordless methods now, Windows Hello and security keys and the Authenticator app. These are all great new ways to sign in. But then on the back end, there are still flows that fall back to a password. And a lot of our account recovery flows, or even compromise recovery flows, they require you to set a new password when you get hacked. So things like that are still, unfortunately, reliant on passwords. But down the road, we do see a world where we can just get rid of passwords and have all these much better ways to authenticate and recover accounts.
I'm happy to also kind of just jump in briefly here, right? So
Sure.
I think the issue again comes back to the up-to-dateness of many of these other types of factors. And clearly there are things where the life cycle, if we think about it, of the particular credential is managed by someone else. Those are kind of like the holy grail, right? If you're able to rely on something that is being kept up to date by some other third party, just as part of the user's kind of daily life, that sounds pretty amazing, right? So the first thing that all of us probably looked at was phone numbers, right? The idea being that if a user loses their phone or upgrades, they would simply go to their carrier, explain to the carrier what happened, prove their identity to the carrier, get their phone number back. And again, we can just keep trusting in that exact same phone number. Now, it didn't quite work out that way. If we think about 2SV, there's reasons why for multi-factor authentication, SMS and phone number-based 2SV isn't really kind of the pinnacle of security anymore, because, of course, those identity proofing techniques at the mobile carriers aren't always of the same level of quality and security, and that bar isn't set at the same place all around the globe. If you're just considering the US, then maybe you have a certain bar. If you look at Japan, the bar might be very high. If you look at other parts of the world, that bar might be a little bit lower. So kind of trusting in a third party which does this credential kind of lifecycle management on your behalf seems pretty cool. Now, of course, driver's licenses is one thing. That's a hard one because, like, at what point in time do you prompt the user to give you their driver's license, right? That might not make a whole lot of sense for a lot of different use cases. In a regulated space, like maybe it does, right? But in others, it might not. So that's the one thing. The other one that's interesting that one might look at into the future, and that's kind of without commenting really on what we're doing in particular, but another one might be payment cards, right? If you think about that, most users today are happy to provide payment credentials to services for various reasons. Maybe it's because they want to use tap and pay on their phone itself. Maybe it's because they're doing business with you. What if you could leverage the fact that your financial institution knows a lot about that particular user and kind of have that information flow somehow, right? So the trick here is to look at, I think in general, to look at third-party organizations that can help with this process and who has that kind of regulated relationship with the user. I think that's really where this is coming down to. It's much, much, much easier said than done, but essentially, if you can solve that life cycle problem, I think you've solved a lot of the account recovery problem.
That's great. Thank you. Very interesting. So the idea is that it's relying on another authoritative source, trusted authoritative source.
I may add something here, Dave.
Thanks, Abbie. Yes.
Yeah. So, as you know, we have been working with the FIDO Alliance, which is basically bootstrapping your digital identity with verified credential.
Mm-hmm.
So, going to what Christiaan is saying, the end of the day, you need the breeder source document breeder, the trusted document providers, like your driving license office or your health, for example, institutions, or your passport office, or your birth certificate. These need to participate in the identity vetting and verification. So, depending on which country you are, there is some level of engagement. Like in Europe, a lot of the banking get involved. There is some countries, some have central ID, or universal ID, and the issuer can be tapped back into. And it's not just the freshness of the data, it's the security and authenticity of the provider. For example, some of the work being done with mobile driving license will enable you to validate it's you without releasing your information. Just validating that it is you, but all the identity attributes is, the question is yes, no, which enhances the privacy and other stuff. It has to be commitment in terms of going digital, and I think this is part of the problem that we are having. The countries need to find proper mechanisms where, say, this is your digital identity, you need to be bootstrapped. Like the current pandemic that we have, it illustrated that old-fashioned ways of going to a place in person to validate your identity does not work. You need to go online. So this requires automation with proper trust anchors.
Okay, great. Thank you, Abbie.
Let me add my comment. So
yes,
I think, thank you. I think also the freshness of identity is very important. So I would like to introduce some kind of mechanism for the keeping continuously knowing the user's identity, the assurance of user's identity. So identity proofing such as driver's license might be okay, but the information might be a kind of static information.
Mm-hmm.
So we would like to know currently what is the identity of the user. Yes,
that's great. Yeah, so it seems freshness is a big deal.
Yes and no. I disagree a little bit on the freshness because the idea here, if you want to restore some account, it's the core identity attribute that you're worried about. Is it David or not? Okay, and not where is David now today. Okay, the point is the binding, and it goes back to the issuer. For example, if someone can attest, this is your current picture, it's the same exact picture as issued to your driving license, and you have that driving license and the source coming from your driving office, this is good enough to restore your identity because of the trust ecosystem. If you can have a system where multiple providers can vouch on your behalf, okay, and they're using your driving license as an anchor, that's good enough. But if you want to do more other transactions, this is where you go back in terms of what the access type and the request type. So, you know, freshness is needed, but sometimes it is more of an access control type mechanism. The freshness sometimes in being really intrusive on privacy, because what you define by freshness, or what you want to do, for example, is this is the latest address, is it the valid address or not? But you don't need to know more. You can get yes or no answers on that. You don't even need to know the exact address, as long as the attester can be part of the trust flow.
Okay. That's great. Thanks, Abbie. So I want to thank all of our speakers. This has been great information. Thank you, everyone. And at this point, I want to open things up to the viewers to pose the questions via the chat. And we'll take a look at what's there and either open them up to the panelists in general, or if it's to a specific person, we'll have them provide an answer. So please put your questions in the chat, and thank you.